I'll share the screen. Okay, I hope you're seeing. Okay, Aiko, you can plug in. You all seeing the screen? Review?
Yes.
We are.
Yes.
I'm going to go lickety split. I'd like to finish this today and pick up Sarah where we left them in San Diego, where I just got back from. All right. So just a quick review. The Paris the peace talks in 1919. Jerusalem remained an issue. It was under British, we talk about the Abraham Accords. There was a world where the Hashemites, who were in charge of Mecca, and at the time of the movie Lawrence of Arabia that we're all familiar with, played by Alec Guinness. But he talked about the cousins. And you think about a world where maybe you didn't have the Sykes-Picot. And you'll see a quote later from Ramsey. What if they hadn't discovered oil or known about oil at that time? Maybe the Middle East could have left to evolve naturally instead of going into a new period of colonialism. So there's always that background. Now, the Hashemites are in control of Mecca, but that's not to continue. The Saudis, who for a long time, since the time of the Rashidi dynasty, had been in exile in Kuwait, and they finally came back and started to see if they could reassert their power, which they'd had on a couple of periods. Going all the way back to, well, when he palled up with the Wahhabis in around 1740. But by 1931, he's entrenched. The British are tolerating him, working with him, and tolerating Wahhabism, even though they didn't have to do that with the Hashemites. By the way, they bought off the Hashemites by giving them the monarchies of Iraq. Faisal would be murdered. I see my problem here, Aiko. Maybe I can get you up on the screen. I'm sorry, I missed that. He says the English are my friends, but I'll only walk with them so far. And he had positive views about the United States, which I hinted at the end of last week, and I want to go into it more deeply. This is a very interesting book by a kind of a controversial author, but we don't have time to go into why he's so controversial. But at the time he wrote it, he was an academic with credentials at Yale and even Harvard. And he goes back over United States history in the Middle East, our foreign policy in the Middle East. And he starts off with Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary pirates. So that's how, and I found this book fascinating. The Ibn's, the chapters that I thought were astounding were his explanation of American missionaries throughout the Middle East. But I want to narrow that down to American missionaries with connections to Saudis. And to talk about a lost cause, right? Here you are under the influence of Wahhabis and missionaries. American missionaries are never going to turn their head. But the missionaries from the Reformed Church of America, they came in with hospitals and schools. So they were a full service mission, and they started treating Ibn Saud and his family and the hospitals and their public health programs. And I found it just absolutely fascinating. But Orrin talks about where this missionary fervor actually took shape. It had always, America had always been a promised land. That was the pilgrims' lingo. But he talked about this haystack prayer meeting on a specific date in 1806. And it may have also been the beginning of the second Great Awakening. That the Great Awakenings, we may be up to 4 or 5 now, and we don't have time to get into that. But this was definitely one. And my family in Kentucky was pulled up into the prayer meetings that started happening a little after this, but it was at Williams College, and they're out musing in this haystack. Apparently, I don't know if they were drinking, but they started saying we ought to save the people of Asia. And one thing led to another, and they started an organization, and they had missionaries in India within 6 years. Go figure. Also in this movement, there were some German missionaries named Steinbach, and they changed it to Steinbeck. Yes, that's Steinbeck family. But there's a commemoration stone of the haystack prayer meeting. And I want to now go to the medical care component of this. There was one particular doctor missionary, and he was named Paul Harrison. And he wound up treating the Saudi family. And so just remember, in the background, he's running a clinic, and they're doing schools, teaching English and industrial skills. And it doesn't seem to matter too much that no Arabs are converting. They just keep going. I ran down his New York Times obituary, and sure enough, there it was. He was a graduate of Johns Hopkins. So I also saw if I could get any a confirmation of this from another source, and it turns out that there was a dissertation written and delivered and 5 years ago on the American missionaries, and then eventually Ramco. But at the time in 1914, when the missionaries contacted and came to contact with the Saudis, they weren't in Mecca yet. They were still out in the middle of nowhere. And they didn't know about oil, but all this teaching modern skills is certainly going to do what they intended, which is to overlap their missionary with secular understanding. And they had this whole theory about how Arabian societies were on the ladder of historical development. And that the United States had a moral duty to do what they could to bring about the advancement of non-Christian societies, which is pretty darn enlightened. I think Barbara and Carol have joined us, one of our original core. Nice to have you both. And so there, this story of Carl Twitchell, he was an American engineer who originally went to Europe, to Cyprus, in the copper mines. One thing led to another. He heard there was gold down on the Saudi peninsula. He goes down there. But what the Bedouins want more than anything is water. So I said, yeah, okay, I can look for water and then in my spare time look for gold. Well, as long as you're going after liquid, oil turned out to come on to the agenda. And Twitchell was soon drilling for oil. And in 19, he was hired by SoCal. And I went over this last time. Why there's oil enterprise named SoCal. We talked about there will be blood and the discovery of oil in the southern San Joaquin Valley. And all the development of oil around Los Angeles, the derricks that sprang up in downtown Los Angeles. And when you ride down on those freeways, every once in a while you pass one of those small little oil wells pumping out. So even now. But so SoCal thought that there would likely be oil in eastern Saudi Arabia. And in 1937, sure enough, Twitchell got some promising dribbles. And that came to the attention of the State Department Arabists. Now, Oren spends a lot of time talking about the influence of the Arabists. And their academics, a lot of them are the sons of missionaries, not necessarily the missionaries that went to Saudi Arabia, but the missionaries that went to the Middle East in general. And they had romantic ideas about the Muslims and the Arabs. And you're going to see that they're going to come into conflict because they are not pro-Zionist at all. And that plays out in detail in Oren's book. And it will soon play out in more detail. But Roosevelt famously meets with Saad, I think a couple of times. One was on his ship, and Saad bought his whole entourage and carpets and animals, sheep. They butchered sheep on the ship. It was quite an affair if you read about it. So now, on the other side, who is going to go up against the Arabists in the State Department? And historic serendipity. We've heard a lot of that from Timothy Snyder. He muses, what if Zelensky had left Kiev? He muses, what if FDR hadn't been around to stand up to the isolationists? What if Churchill hadn't been around? I know Ramsey might have some things to say about that maybe it was just fine. Well, I'm going to make the point that I know Ramsey's going to dispute, that what if Truman hadn't been around? And I want to talk about one simple friendship that Truman had that I found inspiring. But in the beginning, Truman was against a Jewish commonwealth. It had come up for a vote, I think, in 1943, and he was one of 30 senators opposing a Jewish commonwealth. He said he was worried about theocracy. As well, he might be, because we've seen that come to the table, unfortunately, in modern Israel. And certainly you have a lot of theocrats in living in occupied West Bank. And his tact was, look, I'm not going to focus on Israel. I want to make the whole world safe for the Jews. I think that was a convenient slogan. But here's the serendipity. When he was a teenager, he met another teenager in Kansas City. Neither of these guys went to college. Truman graduated and got a job as a bank clerk. And Eddie Jacobson was working for small businesses in downtown Kansas City and would come in and make deposits in Harry's bank. World War I comes along, and these two guys wind up in the same training camp. Truman quickly advances to lieutenant because he's a leader of men, and he's age 30, and boy, is he glad World War I came along, because his father made him quit as a bank clerk and to come out and help on the farm. And guess what? Harry Truman hated farm work. And for him, World War II was an escape. So here we are, serendipity. These two guys, from the standpoint of Israel, these two guys were at the right place and the right time. So this one article really overstates it, but I throw it out just because it's an interesting overstatement. But here's what it's based on. Truman and Jacobson needed a canteen. That was the responsibility of Lieutenant Truman. So Lieutenant Truman turned to Jacobson and said, you know wholesale, go out and let's go. And they built one of the most successful canteens in the Army, World War I. And they stayed good buddies. And they were such success that after the war, they opened a haberdashery in Kansas City. It only lasted a few years because there was a big depression around 1920. It was an upscale haberdashery. I don't know if you can tell that, but they decided to go upscale. And they bonded also in their personal life. Jacobson was an avid outdoorsman, and Harry went with him just because he liked them so much. But Truman would take a bunch of books and would not go out and hunt. He would stay in the cabin and read his books. So I really recommend this book. I think Ramsey would probably say it's a little sentimental. But his Gentile friends teased Harry, referring to him as a lucky Jew and Trumanheimer. And Truman just warmed up to it. He says, I'm proud of my Jewish ability. And by the way, he in Kansas City hooked up politically with the Pendergast regime, which was corrupt as hell, but he could operate within that. He eventually became the county administrator. Connie just told me the name. It was Johnson County, I think. County administrator, so he knew how to build public works. And when he wound up in the Senate later on, he was a natural to head the Senate investigating committee on corruption and procuring the supplies for World War II. For World War II, he'd run a canteen in World War I, and in World War II, he was ferreting out abuse. And that's what made his name. Also, what made his name was his enlightened attitudes to African Americans. Why would that make his name? Well, Roosevelt in 1944 needed to kick Henry Wallace off the ticket because he was just a too left wing for the city bosses. And they kind of liked this guy, Truman, because he had good relations with African Americans. And in fact, he'd spoke at the NAACP convention as a senator. And so the big city bosses, they take that guy. Well, what made Truman friendly to African Americans? He noticed in World War I, he's a lieutenant, he noticed that the Southern officers wasted the black soldiers. They didn't deploy them. They gave them scut work. And in fact, they were so misused that the French said, if you're not using those soldiers, could we have them? So a lot of black soldiers served in French regiments, and many stayed after the war. And so FDR picks Truman as Veep, and we all know the rest. And when he got power, he integrated the armed forces pretty quick. I think 46. So once he's president, he's sensitized to the plight of the Jews by Eddie Jacobson. So one of the first thing he does is he appoints a dean of a big university to go and investigate what was going on. And at the end of the war, what was happening in Europe, especially to Jews. I just read this from another angle. It's a book called Facing the Mountain. I read it because it's about Japanese Americans, specifically the 242nd that liberated Dachau. And that's at the end of the book, and the descriptions of Japanese American soldiers having to liberate Dachau and what they saw. That was what was going on at the time. And what was America going to do about it? Well, this dean went over there, and within a couple of months, churned out a bombshell report which harshly criticized both American and British treatment of Jews, refugees, people without a home. So there was that. And we all know the book by Leon Uris, Exodus, starring Paul Newman and Eva St. Marie, I think. And from that, the conclusion of this report by the dean was there should be no liberation without immigration. So immigration was lifted, and it was in keeping with Great Britain's promise in the Balfour Declaration to open the doors of Palestine to stateless Jews. Now, they never said that it would be a Jewish state. They always used homeland, which was a little vague and has caused a lot of problems. But everybody understood that Palestine as a future Jewish home of some kind was in the cards. So Truman says, okay, I'll listen to the Zionists. And Eddie Jacobson brought in a couple of groups to see Truman in 46 and 47. But Truman, frankly, was irked by the aggressive approach of the Jewish leaders. You can imagine they were in a hurry, and they were emotionally wrought, witnessing what they'd experienced, what their fellow European Jews had experienced. But Truman didn't much like people pounding on his desk and shouting at him. And in fact, one visitor tried to bribe him. So he finally was so exasperated, he exclaimed at a cabinet meeting, thinking of, I guess, Jesus's fight with the Sanhedrin. Jesus Christ couldn't please them when he was on earth, so how could anyone expect that I would have any luck? And he blamed both the British for their bullheadedness, because they were in no shape to police the establishment of a Palestinian homeland. So we know how much they suffered. So they were passing the baton to us. And Truman was caught in the middle between the British bullheadedness and what he called the fanaticism of New York Jews. So all along in letters that have been documented by historians, Jacobson was supporting the United Nations partition plan for Palestine. And Truman was open to that. I told you that he would read books on hunting trips. Well, he was very familiar with the Bible and standard history from a teenager on, very early. And he could understand the Jewish homeland and how it fit into the Bible and how it would fit into history. But here's where the Arabists come back onto the scene that I talked about earlier. George Marshall was now the head of the State Department and being advised by the Arabists. And so he opposed the idea of partitioning Palestine, even though the United Nations had recommended it. And he argued that it was going to push them in, the Arabs into the arms of the Soviets, and that it would imperil access of America to that Arab oil that they'd already surveyed and drilled and found. And he was very concerned that U.S. troops would have to be used to contain the violence, just like British troops had to be used in Palestine. So Truman's response, finally, to the arguments about oil was, we're going to handle this with justice, not oil, in mind. So I thought that was a pretty high-minded way of saying it. But Eddie Jacobson wanted him to meet with Chaim Weizmann. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So who was Chaim Weizmann? He was an internet. I actually have a slide later on, but he was a Zionist of long standing. And Jacobson wanted him to meet with Weizmann so much, and Truman was refusing to do it, and the clock was ticking down. It was there were only a couple of weeks before some decision had to be made, and so far the Arabists were winning. And Jacobson flew into Washington without an appointment, because he's one of the few guys that could just walk into the White House. And he told Truman what was on his mind. And Truman remembers, and Jacobson remembers saying, "What are you doing here? You've never asked me for anything." The whole time I've been in the White House, Jacobson had not taken advantage. Finally, after a long pause, Jacobson timidly said, "You must see Dr. Weizmann. You must support an independent Jewish state." And then Truman hardened again. He was brusque, almost unreachable. And and then Jacobson reminded him of the refugees that they talked about, and he remained unmovable because he'd been hectoring by disrespectful and mean people as he saw them. And then Jacobson, he knew Truman, he knew how to get to him. And he said, "Harry, my people need help." And Weizmann traveled thousands of miles to plead the case. And you refuse to see him just because you've been insulted by some of our Jewish leaders. You know, Weizmann had nothing to do with these insults or that approach. He's the last man that would do that. It doesn't sound like you, Harry, because I thought you could take the stuff that they've been handing out. And so Jacobson was the only person probably on earth that could open Truman's mind at the time. Remember, friends for 45 years, in the war together, business partners, hunting trips. And then came the moment where Jacobson spots the statue of Andrew Jackson on his horse. And he appealed to Harry's heart. He says, "Harry, I know you love Jackson. Well, Weizmann, he's my hero. He's my Andrew Jackson." And it was unimaginably far-fetched that comparison made any sense, but it worked. And then Truman turned his back and stared out the window for a long time. Jacobson said it seemed like centuries. And then he turned and he said the most endearing words that Jacobson had ever heard. "You win, you bald-headed son of a bitch." And 5 days later, Truman met with Weizmann, an off-the-record meeting. So who was Weizmann? He was a Russian-born biochemist who'd become a Zionist leader. You can see he was a respected scientist. And he served as the first president of Israel. Weizmann had been around. He had good relations with Arabs. Here he is with his, what Faisal at that time would be calling a cousin. He'd met with other Arabs all along the way, even through the difficult years of the 1930s in Jerusalem. and so Truman had committed to listening to Weitzman, and Weitzman convinced them. Jacobson had softened him up, and there was a final Oval Office meeting on whether to recognize the new Jewish state. And they only had 2 days. And Marshall was steadfast in his opposition. And he even insinuated that Truman was motivated by Jewish votes and contributions for the upcoming 1948 election. And Marshall even threatened to vote against Truman in the election. It turned out that Truman became the first leader to recognize Israel 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion declared independence. And what that did is it gave legitimacy to the new state of Israel, and other countries cover to vote the same way, silenced all doubts about what was going to do. The decision was made, and that was that. And I think you could make the case that this was a decision based on idealism versus realism, but specifically on Truman's bond with his teenage hood friend. Jacobson became a temporary unofficial ambassador, spent a month in Israel, and Truman was praised finally and given full credit for bringing about the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years, and that touched Harry. And we acknowledge the serendipity of history. There are not many politicians who had really such good friends as Eddie Jacobson. What if that hadn't been true? But there it was, and it happened right in downtown Kansas City by two guys trying to make a living. And Truman spoke these words at the memorial when Eddie died. I sent a slide over to Ramsey. He's given me permission for us to muse. What if the U.S. State Department had prevailed, or what if Gandhi had prevailed to avoid partition in India? And too bad we can't see. Kurt Vonnegut, that we just watched the movie called Unstuck in Time, which is the situation for Vonnegut's alter ego, Billy Pilgrim, who can only deal with the bombing, the firebombing and disappearance of Dresden and Slaughterhouse 5 by time travel. Vonnegut could not write about his experience in Dresden. He was in Slaughterhouse 5, which was an underground meat locker, and he only survived Dresden because he was 5 stories underground. Then something that Ramsey and I have been agreeing on forever, that the way out in organizing the world is sort of multinational empires. There's this geopolitical historian that we follow, who's just come out with a new book, The Loom of Time, and that's Robert Kaplan. And for him, and I think for Ramsey, the Ottoman Empire wasn't that bad. I mean, in Lawrence of Arabia, you see the bad side of the Ottoman Empire. But if you look at how open they were to taking Jews who'd been thrown out of uh, uh, Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, and the roles that they were given in the Ottoman Empire. And then the other thing that I'd mention is the EU. Jared Diamonds says that that's one of the great advances of the 20th century, and I think Ramsey agrees. And I just throw in, well, wait a minute, the Abraham Accords. What would that be? It would basically be a confederation of some kind. Certainly, we'd be multi-religious, that's for sure. And Ramsey points out that we, in fact, are a multinational state, and he introduced us to this one book, American Nations, that shows there are, in fact, 6 distinct areas with different attitudes, ranging all the way from the Spanish southwest to French New England, if you will. And what would have been, Ramsey muses, what it would be like if there was no oil in the Middle East, and there'd never been a Sykes-Picot secret meeting to secretly continue colonialism. So I've paraphrased Ramsey, not thinking that he would actually be here, but because he is, maybe he could speak.
Oh, whoa, wait a minute. What? I just woke up. Well, the proposal is absurd. You can't go back and redo history, but in theory, you're supposed to learn something from it. I mean, for example, one could, I think, pretty effectively argue that China, whether you like China or not, is certainly not a nation state. The number of nationalities included in so-called China and different languages and different cultures and different ethnicities is legendary. I mean, talk about Han Chinese as if everyone's sort of the same ethnicity. It's nonsense. There's no such thing as Han Chinese ethnicity. That was just a commitment to Han, like the Roman Empire, a commitment to Han citizenship ideas and so forth. And that's been pretty successful. The Ottoman Empire was certainly successful. I mean, at this stage of the game, we might even want to prefer the Soviet Union surviving as opposed to getting the crap that we got with Putin these days. Mess at this. So it's an argument, and it's also a hopeful thought that how the hell do we get the hell? How does humanity get out of this mess as we indulge more and more populous nation states, saber rattling, hungry, name them. Certainly, that's not heading the world in the right direction. We've sort of thought, those of us that grew up in the 50s and 60s, that the lessons had been learned from World War II and World War I. Nationalism sort of stinks, and here we are again. Well, how to get out of that? We won't know because we'll all be dead. But it's worth arguing about. The Ottoman Empire was, in fact, fairly successful for a long time. What happened? It was overrun by, in the 19th century, it was captured. The sultans were captured by religious nuts who fought against the attempts over and over again. Finally, they worked under Ataturk to become a true modern state with industrialization and all the rest of it. But by that time, the Ottoman Empire had been disassembled. Why was it disassembled? Well, we all know that. The French and British wanted the oil. That's maybe a little too simplistic, but close enough. So I'll shut up, John, for what that's worth.
No,
It's a
that was
thought. It's a thought.
no, are very good thoughts, and in fact, I think I am not going to try to go beyond that. I think I'm going to open it up and I'm going to stop sharing. I hope that my computer doesn't blow up. And I'm going to stop sharing and invite other people to comment on that excellent epilogue.
Or to make it simple, what if John Marshall had succeeded in convincing Truman not to support the partition of Palestine, and that the Jews and Palestinians were forced by the UN to live together and work things out, or the same with Pakistanis and Indians? Would the world be a more hopeful place if Pakistan and India weren't facing each other with nuclear weapons and using crudely, pathetically, religion as an excuse to rally their people against the other nation states?
Yeah.
Would the world have been a better place if Palestine had not been partitioned? It's a useless thought at this stage of the game, but it might be a suggestion of where things go in the 23rd century.
Yeah, and maybe the Truman Jacobson story was not such a great advance after all. Homer.
Well, thanks for all the suggestions of books. One that I've heard about, have not read, but I wonder if it has to do with the Sykes-Picot story. That is A Peace to End All Peace, about the peace at the end of the had to do with reorganizing the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, I think. Do you know this book, or Ramsey?
I've heard of it, haven't read it.
By David Franken. I just always thought the title.
Yeah. It's on the. I think it's even on the bestseller list now, isn't it? Perhaps. But it shows up in journalistic columns all the time now.
And you referred to American Nations by Woodard. The book I'm familiar with is The Nine Nations of North America by Gavreau. And you're right. I mean, he comes down liking, of all the nine nations, he likes the French Canadian one best. But he's not at all sure that the federal system of the U.S. is going to hold together. Thinks the pressures to divide along these lines of history, development, and culture are going to be increasingly stressful, as maybe we're seeing.
Yeah, for sure.
What's made it successful? Well, we won World War II, and for a while got to run the world's economy. But that era is over. And
that's right.
If that's the main glue that held this thing together, then the future is not terribly bright. Perhaps, or it could be. It could be. Let's wait and see in November of 2024.
Well, I think if you put all the strong economies together, the most productive nations, at least for the time being, are more democratic than all the nations together. So we still have a lot of economic heft. The liberal settlement, if you weight it along the economic productivity. Yeah, you got Putin, but Russia is a very small economy when you look at it. I think it's behind Italy. China is not going to overtake the United States anytime soon. They've had a lot of reversals. Turkey has just through its monetary policy gone crazy. They have drifted to a more
Argentina.
autocratic style, but they're not doing at all well economically. So I don't know. I'm just maybe it's not time to surrender.
No, no, of course not. And what you say is right. On the flip side of it, there is the South, the global South. I mean, there's a fair amount of that discussion and among academics and everybody else these days that we focused all of our lifetime on the East-West conflict, and a fair number of people say, yeah, that's not the conflict anymore. The conflict that will determine the future of the 21st century, the 22nd century, is North-South. And we see that. We certainly saw it on October, whatever, what was it, October 6th, I suppose. You can, Saudi Arabia can say, well, we're going to throw our lot in with the West. We've got oil. They're willing to make a deal with us. We can ignore Palestinians. Who the hell cares? They've lost. And suddenly, that's not true anymore. It is interesting how a set of people who have are angry or whatever can shake things up real fast, as was the case in the beginning of World War I with the mess in the Balkans, which exploded into this idiotic thing because they couldn't, the Russians and the Germans and so forth couldn't sort out what to do in the Balkans. Who cares about the goddamn Balkans? The Balkans don't matter. Well, they did matter, so forth. So angry people can throw sand in the works, as we see with guns, mass shootings in the country, and this and that and so forth. So it's got to do with more than just economics. It's got to do with a sense of justice too. And there's some problems there.
Yeah, I'll have a slide up next week. It's a quote from Looming Towers, a quote of Osama bin Laden talking about the looming towers were the burning towers in Beirut from the Israeli bombing. And his response to that arguably changed the world, that's for sure. So it's surprising how well terrorism works and how much control extremists have in the dialogue of everything. And it's kind of depressing.
What's depressing to me is that it works by a formula. And I hope I haven't made this comparison here on this Zoomcast, but reminds me of who wrote the book of love. It follows for chapter 1 is this, and chapter 2, and after chapter 4 you break up, but you give it just one more chance. You can write who wrote the book of terror. The terrorist commits an act of real atrocity against a power. The power predictably overreacts in a way that outrages world opinion. And then that becomes the issue. And then they maybe, I don't know, they overact even more. It just seems to like us after 9/11. I've been told there was an incident in Bombay where India did not react like that to an act of terrorism, but I don't know any details about it. But it just seems so formulaic, so predictable. What if Israel had said, we have wonderful intelligence. We just want the leaders of Hamas to know they're going to be murdered, maybe without a trial. But we aren't going to savage the innocent people of Palestine to do it, but they will pay the price. And meantime, let us call your attention what those leaders of Hamas did, why we're going to murder them. What if they'd done that rather than this? And what's happening in Gaza is very hard to watch. It's very hard to think about. Anyway, random thoughts.
Well said. And imagine what you just said. Imagine Bush saying the same thing after 9/11. We're not going to go to Afghanistan. We're not going to get ourselves dirty in Iraq and so forth. But on the other hand,
We're going to find and kill,
but
murder.
but he didn't.
But then they let a large number of Saudis escape right after 9/11. Leave the country.
Yeah. That's it. No kidding. Well connected to the Bush family.
Yeah,
So that's all back to Supreme Court and Bush Gore.
Well, they go
that's
back
right.
there, yeah.
Serendipity.
Oh my, yeah.
Yeah, if we could get Sandra Day O'Connor back to change her vote.
So the movie Munich looks at the atrocity at the Olympics
Yes.
and just shows methodically how Israel did just what you enunciated, Homer. Also, I think it was Thomas Friedman who mentioned the Bombay restraint. And I've gone back to try to document it. And my first attempt was not successful, Homer. So I think maybe a letter to Thomas Friedman asking for the details on that.
Well, I can't remember who told me he'd tell me about the Bombay restraint. Oh, was that you? Okay. I was going to pass on what I learned to you, John, but I guess that might not work.
Oh, okay. It's been most enjoyable. Any other comments?
If you suggesting books worth reading, a book I read, I think I should have gone looking for it because I'm going to say things that I'm not sure are completely accurate, but I think it was written during the George W. Bush years, and the intention was to say, let's see the parallels here. And the title was, I'm pretty sure, Another Such Victory. The reference was to what the British said after they successfully won the Battle of Bunker Hill, but lost an enormous number of men. And so,
Right.
if we keep having victories like this, we're going to lose the war for sure. And it was all about Truman. And a fair amount of research and documentary say, look, Truman was maybe a decent guy, but he was led by the nose by a bunch of much more clever, much more sinister advisors. And of course, the implication was, well, we're looking at the same thing with Bush right now, with Cheney and Rumsfeld and the rest. But it's well researched, and it will give you a less complimentary view of Harry Truman. So
it's a good thing that Ulysses Grant didn't have the another such victory feelings after the Battle of the Wilderness.
Yeah, exactly.
And he kept on losing a lot of men, but he broke them. Finally broke the Confederate.
We got more people to die than you do, and we're gonna win. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Sherman gets a little bit of credit for the end of that.
Yes, he does.
And the interesting thing, when we're really going to do California history, I promise. We're going back to Junipero Serra, but what you learn about Sherman is that he was in charge of the U.S. cavalry and was stationed at Sacramento at the time of the Vigilantes outbreak. And he was sent down, I think he came down on boats from Sacramento, specifically to contain the Vigilantes of San Francisco. Coming soon.
Yeah, no, John, you're right. Without Sherman's victories there, Lincoln would probably have lost the election of '64. And then what?
I guess we're all been reading our Heather Cox Richardson.
Yeah, there we go. Good.
Okay.
Well done, John. Thank you as always.
Well done, John. Thanks.
Okay, good.
Thank
Thanks for your attendance. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
John, I go stick on for a minute if you could.
Okay.
Okay. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Before everybody click, so I was